rendering dialogue useless, and non-colorative difference, rendering it impossible. Furthermore, Zussi does not take the travesty of patriotism and nationalism into cultural nationalism, which tries to attract and accommodate, as opposed to illiberal and exclusive militant nationalism, which tries to reject and repulse. Both positions are characteristic of Bohuš and his nemesis, the student Rezek. As the opening scene with the mirror shows, Rilke pays attention to visual elements, for instance, by introducing the melancholic character of the painter Šileda. This is Šikaneda, it's close enough. And for music lovers, this is the grandson of the guy who wrote The Magic Flute, the text, of course. And he does the dreamy pictures. So his dreamy picture parallels Rilke's description of Prague and foreground the ambiguity of the imagery derived from the real spaces of Prague, interlaced with figments of Bohuš's imagination and fragments of his memories. There he finds joy and prospect of happiness by dreaming of his wedding with his beloved, who in reality was his father's lover. In sum, Rilke's story constitutes another type of literariness, one which includes elements of the picturesque. Here it serves as a bridge from Russia to Prague that Rilke called the rich, enormous epic of architecture. And it leads us from scribes to whimsical narrators. Rilke presents simultaneities of chance encounters between the actual and the oniric, and concurrently lays bare the simultaneities of the city and Europe at the turn of the century. His narrative also questions the reading of Prague German literature as a minor literature, as suggested by Deleuze and Guattari. This concept seems to ignore what the historian of the Jewish experience in Czech lands, Hillel Kýval, suggests. I quote Kýval: "The very categories German, Czech, Jew, liberal, communist, patriot, mystic, rationalist, orthodox, and assimilationist, you know what, existed in a state of perpetual movement, seeming to appear only to collapse, regroup, and melt away." Kýval refers to a later period, but Timothy Benson arrives at the similar conclusion when he talks about Central European avant-gardes, and therefore about the time to which Rilke, Kafka, and Hasek belong. According to Benson, neither avant-garde nor nation is a static, essentialist concept. Rather, they are signifiers that constantly shift through the dislocations of historical change. Nor can art exist as a completion or totality in a region where meaning is inherently fragmentary and contradictory due to the conditions under which culture functions. Based on a mixture of his diaries and correspondence, Deleuze and Guattari's study on Kafka does not take the specific historical context into account. This is especially irritating with regard to Kafka's description of the three impossibilities of writing as a Jew in Prague, based on a letter he wrote in 1921 when he was confronted with the new Czechoslovak state. The fact that Czech became the language of administration had an impact on Kafka, the lawyer, who had to mobilize the help of his brother-in-law. Furthermore, the complaint about the impossibility not to write, the impossibility to write in German, and the impossibility to write differently doesn't apply to his or Rilke's experience before the war, to which Yuri Lotman's description of the semiosphere applies. In the reality of the semiosphere, the hierarchy of languages and texts, as a rule, is disturbed, and these elements collide as though they coexisted on the same level. The formation of peripheral semiotics may be represented not by fixed structures, languages, but by their fragments or even separate texts. The fragmentary and contradictory meaning and the perpetual movement of categories are characteristic of this part of Kafkanian, as Robert Musil referred to Austro-Hungarian monarchy, and typical of the work of Franz Kafka and Jaroslav Hasek. The joy of fabulation, or ludic joys. Out with your stories. I no longer want to hear scraps. Tell me everything from the beginning to end. The address of the first-person narrator to his companion on the nightly stroll through Prague might match the reader's expectation. But Kafka frustrates the conventions of such a story. One of his earliest texts, Beschreibung eines Kampfes, description of a struggle, consists of many scraps and introduces characters that look like Czech fairy tale figures, Mr. Tall, Mr. White, and Mr. Sharp-sighted. As they change their appearance unpredictably. However, this dreamlike, oniric fictional world is not the product of a dream, but more like the ending in Gogol's story. In all three cases, the narratives are set in concrete city, I mean Rilke, Gogol, and Kafka. Yet Kafka's fictional world expands the cityscape and includes an unfinished landscape, which at times appears as locus amoenus, as an ironic take on a song that in 1917 became the Czech national anthem, which is an ode to the beauty of the Czech lands and rivers. The cyclic structure of the narrative about an evening stroll of the first-person narrator and his acquaintance is disrupted by a chapter with the enigmatic title, Diversions of our Proof that it is impossible to live, which in turn consists of three subchapters. A ride, a walk, the fat man, which is further divided into an address to the landscape, beginning of a conversation with the supplicant story, continued conversation between the fat man and the supplicant, drowning of the fat man. As the titles of these segments show, this part, framed by chapters 1 and 3, consists of stories within stories told by various narrators. The whimsical central storyteller changes appearance as much as the directions his story takes. Quote, and it really was kind of the moon to shine on me too. And out of modesty, I was about to place myself under the arch of the Tower Bridge when it occurred to me that the moon, of course, shone on everything. So I happily spread out my arms in order fully to enjoy the moon. And by making swimming movements with my weary arms, it was very easy for me to advance without pain or difficulty. The swimming escapade is interrupted by the acquaintance who does not comment on the narrator's newly acquired ability. At the beginning of the next section, the narrator pursues the vertical direction in yet another way. And now, with a flourish, as though it were not the first time, I leapt onto the shoulders of my acquaintance, and by digging my fist into his back, I urged him into a trot. The relationship of the narrator and his companion, however, is not a stable one. In fact, a knee injury mentioned first in the context of the narrator and later as a cause for abandoning his companion suggests that one of the two may be a potential doppelganger, a fashionable concept at the time. I quote, then my acquaintance collapsed, and when I examined him, I discovered that he was badly wounded in the knee. Since he could no longer be of any use to me, I left him there on the stones without much regret, and whistled down a few vultures, which obediently and with serious beaks settled down on hill in order to guard him. There are many more instances that destabilize the predictability of the narration and allow readers to participate in the linguistics and visual games of the text, which at times is reminiscent of a Cubist painting. In 1963, the Czech philosopher Kafkas Wake published a groundbreaking article entitled Kafka and Hasek, or the World of the Grotesque. There he claims Wakeism and the Kafkaesque are universal phenomena that exist independently of the work of Jaroslav Hasek and Franz Kafka. The two Prague writers merely gave names for these phenomena, and their works gave them a certain form. Hasek and Kafka describe and expose the worlds of Wakeism and the Kafkaesque as universal phenomena, and at the same time subject them to criticism. The title of Kosik's article expands Gogol's grotesque character to what he calls Grotesque World, and posits similarity between the two very dissimilar authors born in the same city in the same year, 83, both bearing witness to the perpetual movement between the changing center and periphery. We can skip the next one. Jaroslav Hasek's novel Osudy dobrého vojáka Švejka za světové války, The Fortunes of the Good Soldier Švejk During the World War, published in 1923, introduced, according to Roman Jakobson, an internationally novel style of humor. The novel opens with the assassination of Ferdinand d'Este, almost exactly a century ago, but ends before the protagonist faces the trenches. Hence, the horrors of the war enter the text mostly as a monstrous backdrop for Švejk, who goes to war, as Jankovic says, goes to war to tell anecdotes. The cause of the war and the war itself have no particular significance, for, as Milan Kundera observes, in Homer and in Tolstoy, war had a perfectly comprehensible meaning. People fought for Helen or for Russia. Švejk and his companions go to the front without knowing why, and what is even more shocking, without caring to know. Hasek's grotesque universe evokes a big democratic pub, in which the assassinated Archduke Ferdinand d'Este is just like the Ferdinand who collects the dog manure, or the one who is a messenger for a chemist. To stay alive, to dodge that danger, Švejk becomes a creator of stories, someone who is command of another space-time continuum. The way he presents them and the popular oral tradition they evoke resembles urban tales. Švejk talks himself out of a precarious situation or situations, or as Milan Jankovic says, he escapes danger through his talk. Yet, unlike Scheherazade, he has to satisfy a variety of addressees. In his dangerous confrontations with superiors, Švejk's tales chain and embed a number of incongruous narrative elements, which Todorov finds typical also of the Arabian Nights. Indeed, what Todorov says about the Arabian Nights applies to many Švejk stories. By telling the story of another narrative, the first narrative achieves its fundamental theme and at the same time is reflected in this image of itself. Furthermore, like the narratives in the Arabian Nights, most of the yarns in Schweik are modeled on popular oral storytelling. Some resemble urban folklore, especially as found in the male talk of taverns and beer halls. Others are the base versions of sacred texts. Other, again, parody such simple forms, it's quoted by Joles, author, as the exemplum memorabilia, legend, and riddle. Thus, Schweik asks the medical experts the riddle. Take a 3-storied house with 8 windows on each floor. On the roof, there are 2 dormer windows and 2 chimneys. On every floor, there are 2 tenants. And now, tell me, gentlemen, in which year the house porter's grandmother died? Instead of replying to his nonsense riddle, the experts declare Schweik a patent imbecile, for he expressed himself in terms such as, "Long live our Emperor Franz Josef," which utterance is sufficient to illuminate the state of mind of Josef Schweik. When he faces his superiors, incongruous narration is the rule. While Scheherazade manages to capture the attention of the king and thus prevents her imminent execution, Schweik achieves a similar effect by confusing his listeners. Unlike Scheherazade's king, who wants to hear the continuation of her story, Schweik's interlocutors are annoyed by his talk and order him to stop. Since the imperative of the German verb silent is schweig, keep quiet, the command may give a clue for his name. The fact that Schweik talks even in his sleep highlights his joy of fabulation. Compared with Kafka, Schweik and the other narrators in the novel do not change their appearance and are not allocated separate segments of the narration. They present a collective, a semiosphere with no constant center or periphery. Now we are moving to Joy of Collection, which Jean actually mentioned, so you know that I'm going to talk about Hrabal. You know one figure clearly. In the middle is Václav Havel, and the man who is talking with his pretzel is Bohumil Hrabal. Actually, the 2 guys are visiting Hrabal in his favorite pub. Okay, so this is the pub at Tigr, where I took my kids to show them Hrabal, but that's many, many years ago. And I did it very discreetly, so I didn't. In 1967, the writer Bohumil Hrabal introduced his audience to his favorite authors. His selection included writers who were forgotten or politically shunned, Hasek and Kafka among them. Incidentally, Kafka, the only non-Czech writer, even though that's iffy because with the name of Kafka, you have to have Czech roots. So, Kafka and Hasek inspired one of the Kafka inspired one of Hrabal's stories called Kafkárna, Kafkaesque. Hasek's novel, which was to him pure joy in writing, was another source of inspiration to him. In 1977, samizdat edition of Too Loud a Solitude, Hantja, a distant relative of Akaki Akakievich, as well as Schweik, appears as a lowly character that enjoys working in a paper mill, which gives him the opportunity to experience the joy of reading and collecting. Out of the parcels he is supposed to pulp, he creates his own artworks, which resemble surrealist collages or assemblages of literary and philosophical texts, and reproductions of famous work of art, drawing parallels such as the following. I saw Jesus as a playboy and Lao Tse as an old, bland, abandoned bachelor. I saw Jesus raising an imperious arm to damn his enemies and Lao Tse lowering his arms like broken wings. I saw Jesus as romantic, Lao Tse as classicist, Jesus as the flow, Lao Tse as the ebb. It will come as no surprise that when a new machine threatens to deprive him of his joy of collecting such an exquisite company around him, Hantya ends his life using his treasured machine. Like Hasek, Hrabal also uses urban tales, but his are independent of the recipient. They express the joy of collecting words, of what he called pabení, most translated as palavering, and James Wood characterizes it as an anecdote without end. Hrabal is an artist who places his quotes, allusions, references into his text, as Hantya does with his parcels. Inspired by both Kafka and Hasek, the magic appears within Hantya and his parcels. Another source of joy for Hantya are central heating rooms where men with higher education chained to their jobs, like dogs to their kennels, write the history of their time. I didn't explain the term samizdat, that was self-publishing in the 70s. And done by those guys in those basements. Okay, absence of joy. What Hrabal alludes to are those intellectuals who were deprived of their previous work after 1968 and had to perform all sorts of menial jobs. As Philip Roth writes in his Prague orgy, the menial work is done by the writers and the teachers and the construction engineers, and the construction is run by the drunks and the crooks. They get along better with the Russians. I imagine Styron washing glasses in a Penn Station barroom, Susan Sontag wrapping buns at a Broadway bakery, Gore Vidal bicycling salamis to school lunchrooms in Queens. I look at the filthy floor and see myself sweeping. Hrabal himself was not able to publish his book before 1950, books, all of them, in a time in which Milan Kundera describes in his novel, The Joke. He mentions in The Curtain, an essay in 7 parts, that the novelist is not a wallet to historians, but he himself captures the time in which joy was declared to be the historical optimism of the working class. It was an ascetic joy, festive joy, simply joy.
Bylo to opojení. Rozhodovali jsme o osudech lidí a věcí. Zdálo se nám, že držíme v rukou volant dějin. A to nás zavazovalo k radosti. Byla to radost vážná a nepřipouštěla žádnou legraci.
I leave them. I think they're fabulous. This absence of individual joy could be expressed, as Kundera shows, in 2 ways. Through sex, or rather eroticism, and jokes. Both were absent as literary topics in permitted publication in times of ascetic joy and optimism, a period of predictable derivative works which adhere to the principles of socialist realism and could be described as socialist kitsch, that both conformed to current ideological proclamations and were accessible to the masses. By contrast, Kundera's literary works of the 60s were considered subversive not only because of the subject matter he used, the lack of joy in times of officially expressed optimism, but also because of the fact that he abandoned linear stories and introduced a polyphonic structure. An epitome of socialist realist kitsch was the statue of Stalin. Now we have to say goodbye. They are equally good. That uglified one of the most visible public spaces in Prague. It was the largest group statue in Europe. It measured 15 meters in height and 22 meters in length. Sorry, I don't know it in feet. Built in 1955, after Stalin's death, it lasted in Prague for 7 years before being demolished. What remained was nothing, or according to the semiotician Vladimir Matsura, a minus Stalin. Matsura refers to the term minus device coined by the Russian formalist as a visual impulse pointing to the empty space and as a locus of absence of joy and anticipated joy of absence. Okay, so it's a wonderful film. After 1989, some alternative artists organized art installations there in the basement, sanctioned by the presence of the new president of the Republic, Václav Havel, who expressed the joy of absence by calling the newly used basement the space of joy. In 1991, a metronome erected atop the massive stone planks began to indicate the tempo of the city, combining the visual impulse with an absent acoustic one, marking the changed urban history, the city as archive of absence, Linda Hutchison, but that would be a topic for another talk. For now, I hope I have stirred some joy of comparison. I will end my meandering journey by wishing all of us to follow the words of this old student song, Gaudeamus igitur, let us rejoice and enjoy the conference.